Everyone thought Clara buried her husband with all his secrets, until she found the box he never meant for her to see. Where are you watching from? A quiet little town like hers? A rainy corner of Venice? Or somewhere you go when you need a story to hold on to? Tell us in the comments, because this one isn't just about love. It's about what we never say out loud, and what we leave behind in ink. It was 3 days after Daniel's funeral when Clara finally stepped into his study. Not because she was ready, but because the silence behind the door had become heavier than the grief in her chest. The room was just as he left it. Books stacked in uneven towers, his old pipe resting in the tray, and a faint smell of cedar and thyme that clung to the air like memory. She wasn't looking for anything. Maybe just a note, a forgotten keepsake. But instead, hidden behind the legs of an old typewriter, was a wooden box. Plain, dusty, unmarked and quietly waiting. Clara didn't know why her hands were shaking as she opened it. Inside, tied with a ribbon so faded it barely held color, were letters. Dozens of them. The paper was soft and yellowed with age, but the ink still looked alive, each envelope addressed in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. To someone named Isabella. In Venezia. Venice. She froze. Clara didn't know an Isabella. Daniel had never spoken her name. But there it was, written again and again. Like a name he once couldn't stop saying. The earliest letter was from 1972. The most recent? 2 years before she ever met him. Each letter ended the same way. Con amore eterno, Daniel. With eternal love. Clara stared at them, her breath caught somewhere between confusion and heartbreak. Was it betrayal? Or something else? She opened one. The words were in Italian, flowing and elegant. She couldn't understand every phrase, but the feeling poured through. Longing, nostalgia, grief, and tenderness. He wrote of a small cafe near the canal. Of a bridge where they once stood as the sun rose over the water. Of a woman whose laughter stayed in his bones. This wasn't just a memory. It was a life she had never known existed. Clara wasn't angry. Not yet. But she felt something shifting inside her. A quiet unraveling. Daniel had loved before. Deeply. And he had kept that part of himself hidden. Not to deceive, but to protect something fragile. Clara pressed the letters to her chest. For a moment, it felt like holding a ghost. She whispered the name, Isabella, as if it might answer back. She didn't know who this woman was, or what had become of her. But she knew one thing with certainty. This story wasn't finished. And it was time she heard the rest. Clara didn't sleep that night. She laid the letters across her dining table, careful not to crease or tear the aging paper. Each one felt like it pulsed with its own memory, its own silence. The words, written in sweeping Italian, were more than declarations of love. They were fragments of a past life. A life Daniel had lived long before he ever met her. One that had never truly left him. She spent hours holding them up to the light, tracing her fingers over names of cafes, street corners, bridges. Each sentence a quiet thread pulling her deeper into a story that didn't belong to her, but now refused to let her go. When the sun began to rise, she noticed something odd. One envelope hadn't been opened. It was addressed like the others, but instead of Isabella, it simply read, "To myself, Venezia." Clara's heart skipped. She turned it over. There was no stamp, no date. Just Daniel's handwriting, less steady, as though written in later years. Inside, there was a single sheet. The ink was faded, but the words were still legible. They weren't romantic. They were reflective. "I never sent these. Not one. I wrote them to remember. To keep her real. Isabella was a season, a wild and fleeting summer in a city that never forgets. And I was never brave enough to tell her goodbye properly. So I wrote instead." Clara folded the letter carefully, her fingers trembling. He never meant for Isabella to read them. They weren't for her. They were for him. Every page was a way to grieve something that never got to finish. And Clara, she understood that more than she wanted to. Love doesn't always end with closure. Sometimes, it just fades quietly, into letters that stay tucked in boxes and hearts that move on with pieces still missing. She thought of her own life with Daniel. The Sunday morning routines. The way he always paused mid-sentence when he got emotional but never explained why. The distant look in his eyes whenever Venice came up in conversation. Now she understood. That look wasn't avoidance. It was memory. The next morning, Clara sat in the back corner of the public library, surrounded by Italian dictionaries and translation guides. She didn't trust an app with something this fragile. She spent hours cross-referencing phrases, whispering the translations under her breath as she read. One letter spoke of a cafe with blue shutters and a crooked sign, Il tempo fermato, which meant time stopped. Another mentioned a bridge, the one where the pigeons always gathered. A few described people, Luca, who always brought Isabella her espresso without her needing to ask. Giovanna, the cafe owner's daughter, who laughed like the clinking of teacups. It wasn't just love he had captured in those letters. It was a whole city. As Clara read on, something shifted. The letters stopped being painful. They became something else entirely. Beautiful. Honest. A chronicle of a man learning what love even was. Daniel's early letters were poetic and impulsive. He was in his 20s, heart wide open, reckless in the way only youth allows. He wrote about stolen kisses and heartbreak like someone who believed the world might end from it. But the later ones? They were quieter. Wiser. He wrote not of wanting Isabella back, but of thanking her. You taught me to sit in silence and still feel full. You showed me that love isn't what you take, but what you leave behind in someone else. Clara closed the last letter and sat in the quiet. Daniel hadn't hidden a betrayal from her. He'd hidden a lesson. A soft, aching truth he hadn't known how to explain while he was alive. That his love for her, for Clara, had been shaped by the one that came before. And somehow, that didn't make it feel smaller. It made it feel deeper. That night, Clara poured herself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The box of letters rested beside her. No longer mysterious. Just heavy with meaning. She stared at the map of Venice on her phone. Zoomed in on a canal near the Rialto Bridge. Then typed in a name, Il tempo fermato. And there it was. Still standing. A little cafe with blue shutters. Her eyes filled with tears. Because it wasn't over yet. Whatever Daniel had started in those letters, Clara had decided she would finish. Clara had never been the kind of woman who booked last-minute flights. She was the type who made lists, who packed 3 days in advance, who rolled her socks and counted chargers twice. But grief does strange things to a person. So does curiosity. 2 days after reading the last letter, Clara stood in line at the airport. Passport in one hand, a leather satchel in the other. Inside it, Daniel's letters. Every single one. She didn't know what she was chasing. Closure? Answers? Maybe she just wanted to see the world through the eyes of the man she loved. Before he ever became hers. Venice greeted her with rain. Not a storm. Not a drizzle. Just that steady, soft rain that makes the stones shimmer, and turns the air into a kind of dream. Clara stood outside the airport terminal, watching water taxis glide across the lagoon like shadows. She had never seen a city that floated. It felt like stepping into a painting she had somehow been part of, without knowing. She arrived at her hotel in the late afternoon. A small place, tucked between a flower shop and a bakery that smelled like warm lemon and sugar. Her room overlooked a narrow canal, where gondolas passed slowly, the water sloshing softly against the stone. Clara didn't unpack. Instead, she opened the letters again. Daniel had mentioned a cafe with blue shutters, a crooked sign that read Il tempo fermato. Time stopped. She whispered it aloud to herself, testing the words. They felt fragile in her mouth. But strangely right. She pulled up a map, fingers trembling slightly. And there it was. Still open. Still real. Just a 10-minute walk from where she stood. Clara didn't wait until morning. She slipped on her coat, grabbed her umbrella, and began walking through the alleys of Venice. Her footsteps echoing on ancient stones. Everything looked like the letters had described. The worn buildings with ivy curling up their sides. The balconies draped in linens. The quiet lapping of water always close. Like a second heartbeat. She turned a corner. And stopped. There it was. The cafe. Il tempo fermato. The shutters were indeed blue, faded, but still proud. The sign above the door leaned slightly, just as Daniel had written. And inside, through the rain-fogged windows, she saw a man with silver hair, wiping down a table. She stepped inside. A bell chimed overhead. The man looked up. And paused. His eyes lingered on her face. Then dropped to the satchel in her hands. "Say, Clara?" he asked quietly. She blinked. "Yes," she whispered. The man nodded slowly. "I thought so," he said. "You have his eyes." His name was Luca. He had been here all his life, born upstairs, raised in the kitchen. He remembered Daniel vividly. "Ah, Daniel," he said, sitting across from her with 2 tiny cups of espresso. He came like all broken men do. Quiet, polite, eyes too full of things he didn't say. He smiled sadly. He and Isabella, they were like the sunrise over the Grand Canal. Beautiful. Brief. And always a little too bright to look at directly. Clara listened, sipping the espresso she didn't need. Luca told her how Daniel had returned to Venice long after their love had ended. Just once. Years later. He didn't come to reignite anything. He came to say goodbye. But he couldn't bring himself to do it in person. So he wrote. Again and again. And he left the city with a box full of letters he never mailed. Clara sat in silence for a while, watching the canal through the window. It was strange. She had expected pain. Jealousy. Some sort of betrayal. But what she felt instead was peace. Daniel hadn't kept a secret lover. He had carried a memory. One that had shaped the way he loved. And somehow, that didn't feel threatening. It felt generous. Like he had learned how to love someone fully. Because he once lost someone he never truly had. Luca reached into his apron pocket and slid a folded napkin toward her. Come back tomorrow, he said gently. I'll take you to her. Clara looked at him. Isabella? She asked. He nodded. She's still here. Old now. But her eyes haven't changed. Clara walked back to her hotel that night in the dark. Rain tapped gently on her umbrella. And the city whispered around her in a language she was beginning to understand. She didn't know what she'd say to Isabella. She didn't know what answers she still needed. But for the first time since Daniel's death, she didn't feel alone. Not really. Because somehow, somewhere between grief and cobblestone, between letters unsent and stories unfinished, Clara was starting to see the whole picture. Morning came slowly in Venice. The city woke with the soft clang of bells, the creak of shutters opening, and the steady splash of oars against canal water. Clara stood at her hotel window, the box of letters sitting quietly on the table behind her. She hadn't touched them since last night. She didn't need to. Today, she would meet her. Isabella. The name that once felt like a threat now felt like a whisper from the past. Not a rival. Not a ghost. Just a woman, like her, who had once loved Daniel in her own way. Luca met her just after breakfast. He wore a pressed shirt and carried a small bouquet of white lilies. She likes flowers, he said softly. Even if she can't always remember who they're from. They didn't speak much as they walked. The streets were quiet, still slick from the early morning rain. The sky was pale, almost silver, and pigeons fluttered in soft bursts from rooftop to rooftop. Clara clutched her bag tighter as they reached the building, an old brick structure nestled beside a garden wall. There was no sign. No grand entrance. Just a simple wooden door. And time. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of chamomile and old books. Nurses moved quietly. Someone played a piano in another room, the notes soft and a little off-key. Luca led her down a corridor lined with framed black and white photos, young couples, gondolas, and masked dancers from decades ago. She's in the garden, he said gently. She likes the sun when it's not too strong. Clara followed. And there, under the canopy of a vine-draped trellis, sat Isabella. Her hair was white, pulled back into a loose braid. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, were spotted with time but steady. She looked up as they approached. And her eyes, sharp, piercing, impossibly blue, met Clara's without hesitation. Lucas stepped forward first. "Isa," he said warmly. "You have a visitor." Isabella studied Clara for a long moment. Then she smiled. "It's you," she said. Clara blinked. "You know who I am?" The older woman nodded slowly. "I wondered when you'd come." They sat together in the garden. 3 chairs, 2 women, 1 history between them. Clara wasn't sure what to say at first. She had imagined this moment so many times, had braced for anger, for grief, for awkward silences. But instead, Isabella offered her a cup of tea and pointed to the sky. "The birds sing louder here," she said. "Even in the fall." Clara smiled softly. "Daniel used to say that." Isabella's expression flickered, and she looked away for a moment. "I know." There were no accusations. No competition. Just stories, traded gently, one after another, like old letters found in a drawer. Isabella told her about Daniel's first visit to Venice. He had been young then. Restless. Too charming for his own good. He had this way of listening, Isabella said, her voice far away. Like he was memorizing your soul. Clara laughed, unexpectedly. "Yes. He never forgot anything. Even the things you tried to hide." They talked for hours. About poetry. About what Daniel used to cook when he was nervous. About the cafe with blue shutters. About the letter he never sent. Clara reached into her bag and handed it to her. "Daniel's unsent letter to myself." Isabella unfolded it, slowly. She didn't cry. She just closed her eyes. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "He kept his promise, then." Clara looked at her. "What promise?" Isabella smiled, eyes still shut. "He said, if he couldn't have me, he'd find someone worthy of the love I taught him." Her voice cracked, just slightly. "I didn't think he'd ever do it. But then he found you." There was a silence after that. Not awkward, not heavy. Just full. Like the last note of a song you never wanted to end. Clara stood, unsure what to say, unsure what to feel. But Isabella reached out, gently taking her hand. "I never hated you," she said softly. "I prayed you existed." When Clara walked out of the nursing home, Venice was golden. Not just from the light. But from something else. She couldn't explain it. A weight had lifted. Not all of it. But enough. She looked down at the cobblestones beneath her feet and thought about love. How it changes us, how it leaves us. How it finds us again in ways we never expect. And for the first time since Daniel died. Clara smiled. Not because she had all the answers. But because, somehow, she no longer needed them. It was nearly sunset when Clara returned to her hotel. Venice had shifted again. From gold to amber, from warmth to something quieter. The streets had thinned, the bells had hushed. The city was folding itself back into stillness. As if it, too, needed to breathe. Clara sat at the small desk in her room, the window open just enough to let in the cool air and the faint scent of the canal. She didn't move for a while. Not because she was tired. But because something had changed. She had gone looking for answers. Instead, she found understanding. The satchel beside her was nearly empty now. The letters, all read and translated. The questions, most of them, quieted. All but one. Because before she left the nursing home, as Clara stood to say goodbye, Isabella had handed her something folded in pale blue parchment. "This," she whispered, "was never meant for me." Clara hadn't opened it. Not right away. She didn't want to rush it. Didn't want to tear into it like a mystery that needed solving. No. She wanted to be ready. And now, she was. Her hands were steady as she unfolded it. Daniel's handwriting met her like an old friend. The same curve, the same careful way he dotted his I's just a little too far to the right. But this letter was different. It wasn't dated. It wasn't addressed to Venice or Isabella or the past. It was addressed to her. To Clara. "If you're reading this, my Clara, it means I'm gone. And it means you found her. Good. I never wanted to hide her from you. I just didn't know how to explain a love that ended before it began. How do you describe something unfinished? Something that shaped you, but didn't stay? Isabella was a part of my beginning. But you were my everything after. Clara's breath hitched. She had braced herself for pain. For a confession. For one final twist she didn't see coming. But this was something else. She kept reading. Loving her taught me how to feel. But loving you taught me how to stay. If you ever find yourself in Venice, if you're sitting with the box, wondering where you fit into the story, let me be clear. She was the prologue. You, Clara. You were the story. Her hand pressed to her chest. Not to hold her heart in place, but to keep it from unraveling entirely. Tears slid down her cheeks, soft and unashamed. It wasn't that she doubted his love. She never had. But sometimes, the ghosts we don't speak about grow larger than they really are. And now, they were just memories. Not monsters. Clara folded the letter slowly, placing it back in the satchel, this time alone. She didn't need to reread the others. They weren't hers. This one was. The only one. And it was enough. That evening, she walked to the Rialto Bridge. Daniel had written about it in so many of his letters. How it shimmered at dusk. How it always felt like time paused just a little longer there. She stood at the center of the bridge, watching the gondolas pass beneath. The sun was melting into the water. The breeze carried music from somewhere she couldn't see. And she whispered his name. Once. Softly. Then smiled. Because she understood now. Not every love story is clean. Not every chapter ends with a period. But some stretch across decades. Across oceans. And still find their way home. The restaurant Luca chose wasn't grand. It didn't overlook the Grand Canal. There were no candlelit gondolas floating past the windows. No tourists leaning over for photos. It was a small place, tucked at the end of an alley, with uneven tables, handwritten menus, and wine bottles stacked in the corners like old books. But when Clara walked in, it felt like something had already been waiting for her. Luca stood and pulled out her chair without saying a word. Not because he was trying to impress her, but because he understood what silence could hold. And Clara, she appreciated that more than she could explain. They didn't speak at first. They just sat. Two people who had spent the day with ghosts. And now needed to remember how to sit among the living. The waiter brought red wine and a bowl of olives. Still, no one said anything. And then, softly, Clara spoke. She gave me a letter, she said. From him. For me. Luca nodded, slowly, as if he had expected it. As if he already knew. I loved her too, you know, he said gently. Clara looked up. There was no bitterness in his voice. No regret. Just something softer. Sadder. She was my childhood friend. My first love. I waited. A long time. Too long. He smiled, barely. And when Daniel came, I hated him for how easily she loved him. But I also knew I would never be what he was for her. Because I was always there. And he was the one who left. Clara didn't respond right away. She didn't know how. Because suddenly, she saw Luca not as a charming cafe owner. Or the bridge between Daniel and Isabella. But as someone like her. Someone who had loved deeply. And lost quietly. Someone who carried someone else's story in his chest. But still showed up at the table. Still poured the wine. Still remembered how to smile. We both loved people who never fully belonged to us, she finally said. Luca's eyes met hers. And maybe that's what makes us understand each other. They sat with that thought for a while. Not in sadness. Not in self-pity. But in a kind of peace. The kind that only comes when you stop trying to rewrite the past. And start honoring it instead. The dinner came. Fresh pasta, crusty bread, roasted garlic. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she was until the first bite. It tasted like comfort. Like time. Like something made by hands that remembered. She laughed softly at herself. At how strange it was. To be here, across from a man who once loved the same woman her husband had loved. And yet, it didn't feel strange. It felt inevitable. as if life had been folding their paths toward each other all along. After dinner, they walked slowly back through the alleys. The air was cooler now. The rain had dried. The city glittered in the lamplight. They paused on a quiet bridge. Not the Rialto, not famous, not grand, but beautiful in its own hidden way. And there, leaning on the worn stone railing, Luca looked at her. "Do you ever wonder," he asked, "why we're drawn to certain people, even when we know it might end in heartbreak?" Clara thought for a moment. "I think," she said softly, "we recognize something in them. A shape that fits where we've been broken." Luca nodded, like he'd known that all along. There was no romance in the air. No promises. No music swelling in the background. Just two people, older, quieter, maybe wiser, who had both lost love and learned how to carry it forward anyway. And that was its own kind of connection. Its own kind of beginning. As they parted ways at the corner, Luca touched her arm gently. "Tomorrow," he said, "you should go back to the cafe. I want to show you something." Clara smiled. Not because she knew what it would be, but because, for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was walking through a story that belonged to someone else. She felt like it might be hers, too. The next morning, Venice felt different. Lighter. Warmer. Not because the weather had changed, but because something in Clara had. The ache in her chest hadn't vanished, but it no longer hurt to breathe. She walked to the cafe slowly, past flower stalls and women sweeping their doorsteps, past gondoliers sharing jokes over espresso, past windows where linen curtains swayed in the breeze like they were waving her along. Il tempo fermato. Time stopped. She pushed the door open. And time did. Luca was waiting behind the counter. He greeted her with a smile, soft, knowing. Without a word, he led her through a narrow back hallway, past the kitchen, and into a room she hadn't seen before. A storage room, maybe. Walls lined with dusty shelves. A single wooden desk ducked into the corner. He gestured toward the drawer. "It's still here," he said quietly. "After all these years." Clara stepped forward, slowly. Opened the drawer. And there, folded neatly inside a worn sketchbook, was a drawing. A bridge. The one Daniel always described. Their bridge. She recognized it instantly. The slight arch. The lantern on the left side. The ivy spilling over the railing. But what took her breath away was the woman standing on it. Not Isabella. Not Clara. Someone between the two. Drawn not with precision, but with feeling. A woman captured in a moment of stillness. A quiet smile, wind tugging at her scarf. Eyes that held too much to say. And underneath, in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting, "Love lives in the spaces between what was and what could have been." Clara sat down. She didn't speak. Didn't cry. Just stared at the sketch like it was a mirror to a part of herself she hadn't met yet. Because in that moment, she understood something she hadn't before. Daniel hadn't drawn one woman. He'd drawn the idea of love itself. Not as possession. Not as history. But as memory. As possibility. Something bigger than one lifetime. Luca sat beside her. "He left that the last time he came," he said softly. Didn't say anything. Just put it in the drawer and said, "One day, someone will come who needs to see this more than I do." Clara blinked slowly. "And that someone was me?" Luca smiled. "It always was." Later, she stood outside the cafe, holding the sketch carefully, like it might dissolve in her hands if she squeezed too hard. Venice shimmered before her. Not just as a place, but as a memory that didn't belong to just one person anymore. It belonged to all of them. To Daniel. To Isabella. To Luca. And now, to her. Clara didn't book a return flight right away. She stayed. Walked different paths each day. Wrote postcards she never sent. Took her coffee at Luca's cafe, sometimes alone, sometimes with him beside her. They didn't talk about the past much. They didn't need to. Because something had shifted. Not just in Clara, but in the space around her. The grief was no longer sharp. It had become something else. Something sacred. Something soft. One afternoon, She sat by the water and opened a new notebook. Blank pages. No letters from the past. Just space. She wrote the first line slowly, deliberately. Some loves are not meant to last forever. But they echo long enough to change you. She paused, smiled, and kept writing. Because Daniel had loved. Truly. And so had she. Not in the same time, not always in the same way. But deeply. Bravely. Honestly. And maybe that's what mattered most. Love doesn't always ask to be understood. Sometimes, it just wants to be remembered. Venice had changed her. Not in the way Claire expected, not with grand revelations or sudden awakenings. But in quieter ways. The kind of change that happens slowly. Like light shifting across the floor. Like waves lapping at the edge of memory. She was no longer just the widow sorting through a box of old letters. She was something else now. A woman who had walked into someone else's love story. And come out with her own. She spent her mornings at the cafe. Luca always saved her a spot by the window. He never asked how she slept. Never asked what she was thinking. He simply poured her coffee, slid over a biscotti, and offered his company. If she wanted it. And most mornings, she did. Sometimes they spoke of Daniel. Sometimes of Isabella. Sometimes of nothing at all. And those silences? They were never empty. One afternoon, Clara returned to the cafe alone. Luca had stepped out to meet a vendor, and the place was quiet. Only the ticking of the old wall clock, the creak of a wooden chair, and the soft hum of a radio behind the counter. She wandered behind the bar, drawn by something she couldn't name. A pull. A presence. There was a drawer Luca always kept locked. Today, it was open. Inside was a notebook. Faded leather, pages slightly warped by time. She opened it gently. And there, on the first page, was Daniel's name. It wasn't a journal. Not quite. More like a sketch of a novel. A story he'd started and never finished. A story set in Venice. The characters were familiar. A woman torn between the past and the present. A man searching for meaning in the shadows of love. The prose was raw, sometimes messy, but beautiful. And unfinished. Halfway through, it just stopped. No goodbye. No ending. Just blank pages. Waiting. Clara ran her fingers over the final line. Some stories don't need endings. They just need to be lived. She closed the notebook slowly, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't just a story. It was his attempt to make sense of everything. To make peace with what was lost. And what could never be fully claimed. It was Daniel trying to hold on to the parts of life that couldn't be kept. Venice, Isabella, youth, time. That evening, she took the notebook back to her hotel. She stared at it for hours, wondering what he might have written next. Then, finally, she opened her own notebook. And she began to write. Not to finish Daniel's story, but to tell her own. She sat at the edge of the world, where the bridges curved and the water held all the things no one could say. She had loved. She had lost. But more than anything, she had remembered. And that was enough. Clara didn't plan her next move. There was no dramatic decision. No vow to stay in Venice forever, or to return home and start fresh. She just lived. One day at a time. A gondola ride here. A letter mailed there. A shared laugh with Luca as they closed the cafe at dusk. And sometimes, late at night, she'd walk to the Rialto bridge and stand exactly where Daniel once stood. Not to chase his ghost. But to thank him. For loving her. For trusting her with the letters. For giving her a story that didn't belong to just him anymore. Because the truth was, he hadn't left her behind. He had passed her the pen. And now, she was writing the chapter he never got to finish. It had been a month. Clara no longer counted the days. Time had softened here. No longer something to chase or escape. Just something to feel. Venice had become her rhythm. The lapping water. The bells in the distance. The clink of cups at Luca's cafe. It wasn't a new life. But it was a life she hadn't expected to find again. One morning, Clara sat at her usual table by the window, her notebook open, pen in hand. But she wasn't writing. She was thinking. About everything that had brought her here. The funeral. The box of letters. The ache of not knowing. And the gift of finally understanding. She thought about Daniel. How he used to pause in conversation, just to make sure he chose the right words. How he made her laugh without trying. How his love was never loud, but it was always certain. She realized, in all the letters he wrote, he never once asked for forgiveness. Because there had been nothing to forgive. Just a past he couldn't rewrite. And a future he tried to live better because of it. Clara looked out at the canal. Gondolas passed, children laughed, and the air smelled faintly of sea and stone. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't an old letter. It wasn't something Daniel had written. It was blank. She took her pen and began to write. But not to Daniel. To herself. You didn't lose him, Clara. You found what he left behind. A map drawn in memory. A story with no final page. He loved you. Not as a second choice. Not as a replacement. But as the only one he chose freely. You are not what came after. You are what stayed. She folded the paper, carefully. And instead of sealing it in an envelope, she let it rest beside her coffee, uncertain if she would keep it. Because maybe some letters never needed to be sent. Some words were simply meant to be written, so they could finally leave the heart. That afternoon, Luca walked her to the train station. Her bags were light. No souvenirs. Just a notebook. A sketch. And a heart no longer carrying the weight of unanswered questions. As the train pulled away, Venice blurred in the window. Not fading. Just softening. Clara leaned her head against the glass and smiled. She didn't say goodbye. Because she wasn't leaving anything behind. Daniel's story had ended. But hers was just beginning. And somewhere, tucked between the past and the present, between what was lost and what was found, there existed one final letter. The one Daniel never had to write. Because Clara had already lived it. Some stories end with a goodbye. The greatest ones end with peace. And maybe now we ask ourselves, what would you do if you found a letter written by someone you thought you knew, but addressed to a past you were never part of? Would you chase the truth? Would you run from it? Or like Clara, would you choose to understand it and keep loving anyway? Because not every love story ends with a kiss. Some end in silence. Some in forgiveness. And some in a letter never meant to be sent. The truth is, some stories don't need closure. They just need to be remembered. So if this story stayed with you, if it made you think of someone you lost, or someone you still love in quiet ways, then you're exactly who this was meant for. Subscribe to Heartfelt Tales for more stories like this one. Ones that don't just entertain, they stay. Because sometimes, the softest stories leave the deepest marks.